The sky tore open over Harmony Creek, Maine, on a Tuesday. It didn't make a sound, not at first. One moment there was just the flat gray sheet of an October sky, threatening a drizzle that never seemed to arrive. The next, a jagged violet seam split the clouds apart. It looked like a crack in the world's oldest porcelain bowl. From this silent wound in the heavens, something fell. Deputy Frank Miller was the first to see it. He'd been parked by the old quarry, nursing a lukewarm coffee and trying not to think about his ex-wife's upcoming wedding. His radio was crackling with the usual small-town chatter. Somebody's cat stuck up a tree over on Elm Street. Then the light changed. The inside of his Ford Explorer was suddenly bathed in a deep, impossible purple. He looked up from his styrofoam cup, his heart giving a solid, painful thump against his ribs. It wasn't a meteor. Meteors were fire and fury. This thing was graceful. It was a long, crystalline shard, maybe the size of a school bus, tumbling end over end with a slow, deliberate elegance. It didn't burn. It simply glowed, pulsing with a soft internal light like a captured aurora borealis. It corrected its descent as it neared the ground. The tumbling stopped, and it settled into the woods, bordering the quarry with no more noise than a sigh of displaced air. The violet crack in the sky sealed itself shut, leaving the gray afternoon exactly as it had been, only now the world felt tilted on its axis. Frank fumbled the radio to his mouth, his voice catching. "Dispatch, this is Miller. I think something just crashed, out by the quarry." "A plane, Frank?" The voice of Mildred. The dispatcher, who'd been working that desk since before Frank was born, was tinny and bored. "No, Mildred, not a plane." He couldn't explain what it was. How could he? He put the Explorer in drive, his hands slick on the steering wheel. The woods were thick here, mostly pine and stubborn oak. He drove as far as the access road would take him, then got out, pulling his service pistol from its holster more out of instinct than any real sense of purpose. What was he going to do? Shoot a visitor from another galaxy? The thought was so absurd he almost laughed. A dry, nervous bark of a sound. The air in the woods was different. It hummed, not a sound you could hear, but a vibration you felt in the fillings of your teeth. The scent of pine was overwhelmed by something else. Something clean and sterile, like the air after a lightning strike, but without the heat. He pushed through a curtain of ferns and stopped dead. There it was. It was resting in a small clearing, having settled so gently it hadn't even snapped a single branch. The ground around it was untouched. The crystal was a twisting, intricate thing of facets and angles that seemed to defy geometry. It was mostly translucent, but deep inside, veins of soft white light pulsed in a slow, steady rhythm, a heartbeat. Frank stood there for a full minute, gun hanging uselessly by his side. It was the most beautiful and terrifying thing he had ever seen. There was no door, no window, no sign of any occupant. There was only the object itself, humming its silent song to the Maine woods. He took a hesitant step forward, and the light inside the crystal brightened, the pulsing quickened. It was aware of him. He raised his hand, not in threat, but in a gesture of what? Surrender. The light pulsed again, a warm, reassuring beat. He felt a wave of calm wash over him, a deep and profound peace that chased away the tension in his shoulders and the sour memory of his lukewarm coffee. It felt like coming home after a long, hard journey. The Galactic Federation sent aid to Earth. That's what the history books would say one day, Frank thought. This was it. This was the moment everything changed. He holstered his pistol, a slow smile spreading across his face. He felt a tear track down his cheek, but it wasn't a tear of fear. It was a tear of pure, unadulterated relief. The cavalry had arrived. He didn't know then, couldn't have possibly known, that the beautiful, silent thing in the clearing was not a ship. It was a receipt. A receipt for a payment that would be collected in full. Not from him, not from Harmony Creek, but from a star 1,000 light years away. And the price for Earth's salvation was a supernova. The world descended on Harmony Creek like a pack of starving wolves. Within 12 hours, the town's single motel was booked solid, and cars with out-of-state plates were parked on the lawns of bewildered residents. News vans with satellite dishes sprouting from their roofs turned the town square into a technological jungle. Men in dark suits and darker sunglasses arrived in black helicopters that landed in the high school football field, churning up the turf and the local school board's fury. Frank Miller felt like a man trying to direct traffic in the middle of a hurricane. He'd been relegated to crowd control, standing behind a hastily erected chain-link fence 100 yards from the crystal, which the media had already nicknamed the Seraph. It was a good name. The object just sat there in its clearing, radiating a quiet beatitude that seemed to mock the frantic human circus surrounding it. The men in suits, who Frank privately called the spooks, had taken over. They had scientists with them. People who jabbered in a language of quantum mechanics and speculative xenobiology that was as alien to Frank as the Seraph itself. They scanned it, probed it with lasers, bombarded it with radio waves. The Seraph did nothing. It just pulsed its gentle white light, ignoring them completely. It didn't ignore everyone, though. That was the strange part. It seemed to respond to emotion. When a child on the other side of the fence cried, the light would soften. The pulsing would slow, and the child would quiet down, looking toward the woods with wide, curious eyes. When the crowd grew agitated or fearful, the light would dim, almost as if in sympathy. The first real breakthrough came, not from the government scientists, but from a local. Dr. Aris Thorne lived in a cabin 5 miles deeper into the woods, a reclusive astrophysicist who'd been chased out of academia years ago. For theories the establishment deemed too radical, he looked the part. Wild gray hair, a frayed tweed jacket, and eyes that burned with an unnerving intensity. He shambled up to the fence line past the news crews and just stared. "They're doing it all wrong," he muttered, his voice raspy from disuse. "They're treating it like a machine," Thorne said, gesturing with a shaky hand at the spooks and their equipment. They're yelling at it in mathematics. This thing doesn't speak math. It speaks feeling. Before Frank could stop him, Thorne ducked under the fence. A soldier yelled, but Thorne ignored him. He walked slowly, calmly, toward the Seraph. The spooks scrambled to intercept him, but then something happened. The crystal's light flared, not with aggression, but with a sudden, brilliant intensity. Everyone froze. Thorne stopped about 10 feet from the object. He closed his eyes and just stood there. The clearing grew silent, the hum in the air intensifying. Then, images bloomed in the minds of everyone within a quarter-mile radius. They weren't pictures on a screen. They were fully formed thoughts, memories that weren't their own. Frank saw a world with 2 suns, one gold, one silver, hanging in a sky the color of lavender. He saw cities that floated on clouds, structures made of woven light and solid music. He saw beings that were not flesh and blood, but shimmering constellations of energy, moving with a grace that made his heart ache. And he felt what they felt. A deep, ancient peace, a sense of unity that made the concept of a single separate self feel small and lonely. Then the message came not in words, but in a pure distilled concept. We see your suffering, your wars, your sickness. Your planet cries out, we offer a gift. We offer solace. The vision faded, leaving everyone standing in stunned silence. The soldier had lowered his rifle. A newswoman was openly weeping. Frank felt as if he'd been holding his breath his entire life and had only just exhaled. Dr. Thorne turned around, his face pale but triumphant. You see, he said to the lead spook, a grim-faced man named Agent Davis, it's not an invasion, it's an answered prayer. Agent Davis didn't look convinced, but he couldn't deny what had just happened. The message spread like wildfire. The world, poised on the brink of a dozen different kinds of collapse, had been offered a lifeline. For the first time in a long time, humanity felt a collective sense of hope. Only Frank, as he watched Thorne being escorted away for a debriefing, felt a tiny cold splinter of doubt. The vision had been beautiful, the feeling of peace intoxicating. But there was something else. A fleeting undertone he'd barely caught. Beneath the peace, beneath the offer of solace, he had sensed an echo of something else. A profound and terrible desperation. It was like hearing a beautiful song sung by someone who was slowly, silently drowning. The gift, when it was given, was as silent and profound as the Seraph's arrival. A week after Dr. Thorne's first contact, the crystal in the woods began to change. The light within it intensified, the pulsing rhythm becoming faster, stronger. It was no longer a gentle heartbeat. It was the thrum of a colossal engine waking from a long slumber. They called it the Solace Engine, the name coined by a poet laureate. Overcome with emotion, stuck, the effect was immediate and undeniable. In India, a region suffering from a multi-year drought saw clouds gather and release, a gentle, life-giving rain that went on for 3 straight days. In the financial districts of Tokyo and New York, frantic crashing markets stabilized, as if guided by an unseen hand, a wave of irrational optimism replacing the panic. The changes were personal too. Hospitals reported astonishing recoveries. Cancer patients went into remission overnight. A ward of Alzheimer's patients in a Chicago nursing home began to recognize their families, their minds clearing like fog burning off a morning lake. The energy wasn't localized to Harmony Creek. It was global. It was everywhere. It was a soft, persistent hum at the edge of hearing, a feeling of well-being that settled deep in the bones. Harmony Creek became the epicenter of a new world. The chain-link fence came down, replaced by a respectful velvet-roped perimeter. People came from all over the globe just to be near the Seraph, to sit in the woods and bask in its benevolent glow. They called themselves pilgrims. The town boomed. New shops opened selling crystal replicas and t-shirts that read, "I found solace in Harmony Creek." Frank Miller hated it. The town he knew was gone, buried under a landslide of tourists and true believers. He still did his rounds, but now they involved breaking up arguments over parking spaces and dealing with charlatans selling energized creek water for $50 a bottle. The essential goodness of the gift felt tainted by the very human greed it was supposed to cure. He found himself seeking out Dr. Thorne. The government had released the astrophysicist after realizing he was the only one the Seraph, or the consciousness within it, seemed to trust. Thorne had been given a small government-funded lab in a trailer just outside the perimeter. Frank found him hunched over a bank of monitors, the glow of stellar charts reflecting in his glasses. The air in the trailer smelled of stale coffee and ozone. "Shouldn't you be out there, celebrating with the rest of them?" Frank asked, gesturing vaguely toward the woods. Thorne didn't look up. "Celebrations are for when the work is done, Deputy. The work is just beginning." He pointed a long bony finger at a screen displaying a complex graph. "The energy output is staggering. It violates the first law of thermodynamics. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transferred. So the question isn't what it's doing. The question is, where is all this energy coming from?" Frank frowned. "From the Seraph, isn't it? From the aliens. The Federation, or whatever they are. The Seraph is a conduit, a lens, not a power source," Thorne said finally, turning to look at Frank. His eyes were bloodshot. Imagine a magnifying glass. It can focus the sun's rays to start a fire, but the glass itself isn't hot. The Seraph is focusing something, channeling it to us from somewhere else. He pulled up a star chart on the main screen. It was a dense field of white dots. The message, the vision it sent us. It showed a binary star system, right? A gold star and a silver one. Frank nodded. "I remember. I've been searching the astronomical databases, cross-referencing star catalogs with exoplanet surveys. It's like looking for one specific grain of sand on all the beaches of the world." He sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. "But I think I found it. Beig-type yellow dwarf and a smaller white dwarf in a tight orbit. System designation KIC 8,462,852. It's over 1,000 light years away. Unremarkable except for one thing." "What's that?" Thorne zoomed in on a tiny pinprick of light. "Historical data shows its luminosity has been perfectly stable for the 100 years we've been watching it. Until last week." He typed a command, and a new set of data overlaid the old. The light from the distant star had dimmed. It was almost imperceptible, a fractional percentage, a change so small that no one else in the world would have even noticed or cared. But to Thorne, it was a screaming siren. "It's getting dimmer," Thorne whispered, his voice filled with a dawning horror. "The moment our Solace Engine turned on, their star started to fade." Frank stared at the screen, the noise of the happy crowds outside suddenly sounding distant and hollow. The beautiful gift. The answered prayer. It wasn't a gift. It was a transaction, and humanity hadn't bothered to read the fine print. "My God," Frank said, the words catching in his throat. "We're hooked up to their sun." Worse, Deputy, Thorne said, his face pale as bleached bone. I think we're draining it. The world was high on a miracle. The subtle dimming of a distant, insignificant star was a statistical anomaly, a footnote in an obscure astronomical journal. Dr. Thorne's warnings were dismissed as the ravings of a man who'd spent too long talking to himself in the woods. He sent his data to government agencies, to universities, to the new global committee formed to liaise with our galactic benefactors. He received polite automated replies. The world was too busy enjoying its newfound health and prosperity to listen to a doomsayer. But in Harmony Creek things were starting to feel, although the changes were small, easy to ignore if you wanted to. The grass in the clearing around the Seraph, which had grown thick and impossibly green, was now ringed by a circle of brown dead earth that was slowly widening. The air right beside the crystal was no longer warm and comforting. It was cold, a deep, unnatural cold that leached the heat from your body and made your breath fog, even on a mild afternoon. The pilgrims who spent all their time meditating near the Seraph began to change too. Their skin grew pale, their eyes took on a sunken, haunted look. They spoke of beautiful dreams, of floating through cities of light. But when they were awake, they were listless, their energy seemingly sapped. It was as if the crystal was giving solace to the world at large, but taking a tithe from those closest to it. Frank saw it all. He saw the spreading circle of dead ground. He felt the chill. He saw the vacant expressions on the faces of the faithful. His doubt, once a tiny splinter, was now a festering wound. He started spending more time in Thorne's trailer, watching the relentless data stream from the KIC 8,462,852 system. The star was getting fainter. There was no question about it now. The decline was steady, measurable. Thorne had set up an alarm, a soft chime that went off every time the luminosity dropped. Another 100th of a percentage point. The chime was sounding more and more frequently. It's accelerating, Thorne said one evening, his back rigid with tension. Our planet's energy consumption isn't static. As we grow more prosperous, we use more. We build more. We demand more. The engine is simply providing what we ask for. But the people who sent it, Frank said, pacing the small trailer, they must know this is happening. Why aren't they stopping it? Why aren't they sending another message? Maybe they can't, Thorne countered, his voice grim. Maybe the Seraph is a one-way street, a fire-and-forget piece of technology. They send the conduit, it links their star to a world in need, and the process begins. They put their faith in the recipients to be wise enough to manage the gift. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. They overestimated us. That night, Frank couldn't sleep. The gentle hum of the Solace Engine, the sound that soothed the rest of the world, felt like a funeral dirge to him. He got in his Explorer and drove to the clearing. The crowds were gone, save for a few dozen of the most devoted pilgrims. Huddled in blankets against the spreading cold, their faces turned to the pulsing crystal with rapturous devotion. Frank walked to the edge of the dead earth. The cold hit him like a physical blow. He looked at the Seraph, at the swirling light within its crystalline heart. For weeks, that light had been a pure, brilliant white. But now he could see something new. A flicker, a tiny dark tremor in the core of the light, like a spot of rot in a perfect apple. He had to be sure. He had to feel it for himself. Ignoring the unwritten rule about not getting too close, he stepped over the dead ground and walked toward the crystal. The cold intensified, seeping into his bones. The pilgrims murmured, some in protest, some in awe. He reached out a trembling hand and pressed his palm flat against the smooth facet of the Seraph. The peace did not come. The vision of the city of light did not appear. Instead, his mind was flooded with a single overwhelming sensation: pain. It was not a physical pain, it was a vast cosmic agony. The feeling of a star being bled dry, the feeling of a world growing cold, the feeling of a billion voices crying out in silent terror as their skies darkened. It was the collective anguish of a dying civilization, channeled through the crystal and into his mind. He saw for a fleeting horrific instant the other side of the miracle. He felt the life being siphoned away from them to power a stranger's world. He snatched his hand back as if burned, stumbling backward and falling to the dead ground. He gasped for air, his heart hammering against his chest. The Seraph's light flickered again, that dark tremor pulsing in time with his own frantic heartbeat. He knew the truth now in a way that Thorn's charts and graphs could never convey. He had touched the wound. The aid the Galactic Federation sent wasn't a gift. It was a sacrifice. And humanity had blindly, greedily accepted it. "They're not giving it to us, Aris. We're taking it." Frank's voice was a ragged whisper in the confines of the trailer. He was wrapped in a thick blanket, but he couldn't stop shivering. The psychic chill from the Seraph had sunk deep into his marrow. He'd stumbled from the clearing straight to Thorn's lab, his mind reeling from the torrent of alien agony. Thorn listened, his face grim, as Frank recounted the experience. He didn't show any surprise, only a profound, weary sadness. He nodded slowly, as if Frank were merely confirming the inevitable conclusion of a horrifying mathematical equation. "The desperation," Thorn said, his voice low. "You said you sensed it before. This confirms it. They weren't powerful gods extending a hand. They were a drowning people, throwing a lifeline to a neighboring boat, hoping the neighbors would have the sense to pull them in, not just tie the rope to their own anchor and sink them faster." "We have to stop it," Frank said, his voice gaining a desperate edge. "We have to shut it down." "How?" Thorn gestured helplessly at his screens. "The Seraph has no off switch. It's not a machine in a way we understand. It's a quantum entangled siphon. And even if we could somehow destroy it, what would happen? Would the energy backlash destroy a hemisphere? Would the connection just sever, leaving their star to die anyway? We don't know the rules of this game, Frank. We've been playing checkers on a chessboard. Their first move was to try the official channels again, but this time with more urgency." Thorn compiled a new report, including Frank's first-hand account as a psychological addendum. He described the dimming star, the accelerating energy drain, the psychic feedback of pain. He framed it not as a theory, but as an imminent catastrophe for the benefactors. The response was faster this time, but no less dismissive. A sternly worded message from Agent Davis's office informed them that Deputy Miller's hallucinatory episode was likely due to stress and proximity to an unknown energy field. Dr. Thorne's unsubstantiated stellar data was being reviewed, but was considered highly suspect. They were, in no uncertain terms, told to stand down and stop spreading panic. "They don't want to believe it," Frank said, crumpling the printed email in his fist. "The miracle is too good. No one wants to be the guy who tells the world that Christmas is cancelled. And, by the way, we killed Santa Claus." "It's worse than that," Thorn said, his face etched with exhaustion. "Our global economy is now fundamentally dependent on this free energy. Our agriculture, our markets, our climate control. Shutting it off would trigger a collapse on a scale we've never seen. It would be chaos. Famine. War. They're not just protecting a miracle, Frank. They're protecting themselves from the consequences of losing it. The world was addicted. The Solace Engine was the needle in humanity's arm, and Thorne and Frank were trying to tell the junkie that the dose was poison. Frank felt a profound sense of helplessness settle over him. He was a small-town cop. Thorne was a disgraced scientist. They were two men against a world drunk on stolen power. That evening, unable to rest, Frank found himself walking the perimeter of the clearing again. The circle of dead, cold earth had grown. It was now 50 feet wide. The pilgrims huddled at its edge, their faces pale and ecstatic, like moths drawn to a flame that was freezing them to death. The Seraph pulsed in the center, the dark tremor in its light now a constant, rhythmic flutter. It looked sick. He saw a young woman, no older than 20, step across the line into the dead zone. She was one of the regulars, a girl named Lily, with wide, hopeful eyes. Frank had spoken to her a few times. She believed the Seraph was communicating with her, showing her a future of universal peace. "Lily, don't," Frank called out. She turned and gave him a beatific smile. "It's calling me, Deputy. It's time to become one with the Solace." She walked toward the crystal, her arms outstretched. As she got closer, she began to shiver, but her smile never wavered. Frank watched in horror as the light from the Seraph seemed to brighten for a moment, and a visible shimmer of energy, like heat haze on a summer road, seemed to flow from her toward the crystal. She stumbled, her smile faltering, a look of confusion on her face. Then she crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Frank and two other guards rushed in, grabbing her and pulling her back from the killing cold. Her skin was like ice. Her pulse was faint and thready. As they carried her toward the medical tent, Frank looked back at the Seraph. The dark flutter in its heart of light seemed to have lessened, just for a moment. It was feeding, not just on a distant star, but on the life force of those who got too close. The Solace Engine was growing more desperate, more hungry. The price was escalating, and it was starting to collect the dead locally. The message changed. It was no longer a gentle, passive broadcast of peace. It began as a series of jarring psychic pulses, strong enough that people miles away from Harmony Creek felt them. It was like a sudden sharp headache accompanied by a wave of inexplicable dread. In the town, people stumbled in the streets, clutching their heads. At the clearing, the pilgrims cried out, their blissful trances shattered. The Seraph was screaming. Frank and Thorne were in the trailer when the first major pulse hit. The monitors flickered, and a high-pitched whine filled the small space. Frank grabbed the edge of a table as a wave of nausea and vertigo washed over him. But beneath the physical discomfort was an image, stark and terrifying, burned directly into his mind. He saw the twin suns. The gold one was now a sickly, mottled orange, its corona flickering like a dying candle. The silver one was barely visible, a ghost of its former self. The floating cities of light were crashing down from the lavender sky, their structures dissolving into static. The beings of pure energy were fading, their light dimming, their forms becoming indistinct and frayed. And the feeling that came with it was not just pain anymore. It was a clear, articulate, and utterly desperate plea. Misunderstanding. The conduit is a bridge, not a well. A bridge for knowledge. We offered our science, our help, to mend your world in exchange for your help to mend our star. Our sun is dying. Our star tenders failed. The chain reaction is out of control. We sent the bridge, hoping for engineers, for physicists, for help. The message echoed in Frank's skull, a frantic chorus of terror and betrayal. You did not listen. You only took. The drain is too great. The feedback loop is irreversible. You have killed us. They weren't giving us a gift, Frank said, his voice hoarse. They were sending an SOS. Thorne sank into his chair, looking utterly defeated. My God. It's the ultimate cosmic irony. The most advanced race we've ever encountered. And they made the same mistake we always do. They assumed the people on the other end would be reasonable. They assumed we'd read the instruction manual. He let out a dry, rattling sob, but there was no manual. Only a beautiful, tempting button with no label. The world reacted to the new message with confusion and panic. The illusion of benevolent gods was shattered, replaced by the horrifying image of a dying civilization that humanity had accidentally murdered. The story changed. Overnight. The Solace Engine was no longer a miracle. It was a cosmic crime scene. Eggsy Davis and his spooks descended on Thorne's trailer, their grim faces now laced with fear. The polite dismissals were gone. They needed answers. Can we shut it off? Davis demanded, his voice strained. Can we cut the connection? Thorne shook his head slowly. You don't understand. The message was clear. The feedback loop is irreversible. Think of it like a hole punched in the bottom of a dam. At first, it's a small leak. But the flow of water widens the hole, which makes the flow stronger, which widens the hole even more. They were hoping we could help them patch the hole. Instead, we dynamited it. What does that mean, irreversible? Another agent asked. It means, Thorne said, his voice flat and dead, that even if we could shut this thing off right now, their star would still be doomed. It has passed a critical threshold. The fusion process in its core has been destabilized beyond recovery. It's going to collapse. And when a star of that size collapses... He trailed off, looking at the terrified faces around him. Frank finished the sentence for him, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. It goes supernova. A heavy silence fell over the trailer, the soft, deadly hum of the Solace Engine. From the woods outside seemed to grow louder, a mocking reminder of their planetary crime. They had reached out into the cosmos, asking for a savior. They had found one, and they had crucified it. The new message kept pulsing from the Seraph, weaker each time. The images of destruction becoming more faded, the feeling of despair more diluted. It was the last fading broadcast from a world on the verge of extinction. You have killed us, The words looped in Frank's mind, a verdict delivered from across an ocean of stars. Humanity was no longer just a struggling species on a lonely planet. It was now a galactic villain. And there was nothing, absolutely nothing, they could do to stop the sentence they had carried out. The panic was not loud and riotous, as Frank might have expected. It was a quiet, creeping thing, a suffocating blanket of global shame. The news anchors who had once spoken of the Solace Engine with reverent awe now reported on the impending death of the KIC 8,462,852 system with solemn funereal tones. The world had woken up from a beautiful dream to find itself a murderer. Governments held emergency sessions. Scientists from every nation collaborated in a frantic, desperate effort to understand the physics of the Seraph. To find a way, any way, to undo what had been done. But it was like trying to unburn a piece of paper. The consensus was grim and unanimous. Dr. Thorne was right. The star was past the point of no return. Its collapse was inevitable. The question shifted from how do we save them to what happens to us when it blows. The answers were terrifyingly uncertain. The Seraph was a quantum-entangled conduit. When the star on the other end detonated in a supernova, what would come through the pipe? A wave of unimaginable energy, a blast of lethal radiation. Would the Seraph simply overload and explode, taking a chunk of Maine with it? Or would the connection just sever, plunging the Earth back into the energy-starved darkness it had so recently escaped? No one knew. The brightest minds on the planet were staring into a void of complete ignorance. Harmony Creek became a ghost town. The pilgrims vanished, their faith shattered or replaced by a deep, hollow guilt. The tourist shops boarded up their windows. The news vans packed up and left, the story having moved from a local curiosity to a global crisis managed by people in Washington and Geneva. Only the military and the scientists remained, turning the clearing into a fortified research base. Frank stayed. It was his town. He felt a stubborn, irrational need to see it through to the end. He spent his days in Thorne's trailer, watching the countdown. Thorne no longer looked at the data with frantic energy, but with the detached air of a coroner examining a body. "The decay is exponential now," Thorne said one afternoon, pointing to a graph that was now a steep, terrifying curve. "The outer layers are being stripped away, falling into the core. It's compressing, heating up. Any day now." "And the Seraph?" Frank asked, looking out the trailer window at the crystal. It was barely glowing now. The dark tremor had consumed almost all of the internal light. The humming had stopped. The air around it was no longer cold. It was just still and dead. "It's dying with them," Thorne said. "The consciousness that was the traveler, the ambassador, whatever it was, I think it's already gone. The crystal is just a hollow shell now, the last remnant of the bridge." The world held its breath. Power grids were put on high alert. Emergency broadcasts were prepared. People looked at the sky with a new kind of fear, even though the doomed star was invisible to the naked eye. It was a ghost haunting their conscience. They had feasted on a miracle, and the bill was about to come due. Frank felt a strange sense of detachment. The scale of it was too big to comprehend. The death of a star, the end of a civilization. His mind could only grapple with the small things. The memory of the first vision, the beautiful city of light, the desperate, pleading feel of the final message, the vacant look on the face of the young woman, Lily, as they'd carried her away from the crystal. One night, unable to bear the sterile silence of the trailer, he walked to the edge of the military perimeter. The Seraph sat in the center of the flood-lit clearing, a dark, silent monument. He remembered that first day, the awe and relief he had felt. It seemed a lifetime ago. He had thought it was the beginning of something wonderful. He never imagined he was standing at the edge of a grave. A soldier, a kid no older than his own nephew, stood guard at the fence. "Quiet night, deputy," the soldier said, his voice tense. "Too quiet," Frank replied. They stood in silence for a moment, two men watching a piece of dead alien technology, waiting for a distant sun to explode. "You think they knew?" the soldier asked suddenly. "The people who sent it. You think they knew we'd be this stupid?" Frank thought about the question. He thought about the desperation he'd felt from the crystal. The last, desperate gamble of a dying race. "I think," Frank said slowly, "they were hoping we'd be better than we are. I think they bet their whole world on it." The soldier just nodded, looking back towards the silent, dark crystal, and they lost. The end of the traveler was a quiet, private affair. No one felt it but Frank. It happened 3 days after the final, desperate message. He was in his small house on the edge of town, trying to read a paperback novel. But the words were just black marks on a page. The silence of the world was deafening. The Solace Engine was still functioning, still powering the planet, but it was like a machine running on fumes. The hum was gone, the sense of well-being replaced by a collective, low-grade anxiety. He put the book down and closed his eyes. In the quiet of his own mind, he felt a flicker. It was not a message. It was not an image. It was a sensation, faint as a moth's wing brushing against his skin. It was the echo of the consciousness he had touched at the crystal. The traveler. He focused on it, pushing away the distractions of his own thoughts. The sensation grew stronger, a thread of awareness reaching out, not from the Seraph in the woods, but from somewhere deep inside his own memory. It was a ghost in the machine of his own mind, a psychic imprint left behind from when he touched the crystal. He didn't receive words. He received feelings, raw and unfiltered. Loneliness. A vast star-dusted loneliness that made his own small life feel impossibly crowded. He felt the traveler's confusion, its dawning horror as it realized. Its mission had failed so catastrophically. It had come as an emissary of a brilliant ancient culture, carrying a tool of salvation, only to watch it become a weapon of unintended genocide. Then came the memories, fragmented and poignant. He saw through alien eyes. He felt the warmth of the twin suns on a form made of cohesive light. He experienced the joy of soaring through crystalline spires, the air filled with melodies that were both sound and color. He felt a sense of connection to its kind, a unity so complete that the concept of I was almost meaningless, replaced by we all. He saw the first signs of their star's decay, the subtle dimming, the scientific consensus that something was wrong in the core. He felt their quiet, rational panic, their turn to the ultimate desperate measure. The Solace Conduit. A technology so dangerous they had only theorized about it. A bridge to another world, a gamble on the compassion of strangers. And he felt its end. The traveler's consciousness, tied to its home world, was fraying. The beautiful memories dissolved into static and fear. The feeling of we broke apart, leaving a terrified, singular I for the first and last time in its existence. It was the agony of a being whose entire species was dying at once. A pain Frank's human mind could barely contain. He felt a final, faint pulse of emotion directed at him. It wasn't anger, it wasn't blame, it was curiosity. A simple, profound question. Why? Why had humanity not understood? Why had they taken without asking? Why was their first instinct in the face of a miracle not to question but to consume? Frank had no answer. He sat in his armchair, tears streaming down his face, bearing witness to the final moments of a solitary alien soul. He tried to project a feeling back, a feeling of sorrow, of apology. I am sorry we didn't know. He didn't know if the message was received. The presence in his mind faded, not abruptly, but like a candle flame slowly being starved of oxygen. One moment it was there, a faint spark, the next there was nothing. Just the silence of his own thoughts, now feeling vast and empty. He had been the sole mourner at the funeral of a being he had never met, from a world he had only seen in borrowed memories. The ghost in the machine was gone. The Seraph in the woods was now truly just an object, a hollow crystal tomb. And Frank Miller, a deputy from Harmony Creek, Maine, was now the sole keeper of the traveler's last testament, the memory of a beautiful world that humanity had erased from the universe. He got up and went to the window, looking out at the quiet street. The lights in his neighbors' houses burned brightly, powered by a dying star. They were all living on borrowed time, on stolen light. And now the last witness for the prosecution was dead. All that was left was the sentence. The supernova happened on a Thursday morning at 10:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. There was no warning from the sky above Earth, no flash of light, no visible sign. The light from the explosion itself would take over 1,000 years to cross the interstellar void and reach human eyes. The effect, however, was instantaneous. Frank was in Thorne's trailer. The mood for the past week had been one of grim resignation. The scientists monitored their instruments. The soldiers monitored the perimeter. The world waited. Thorne had a special monitor set up, a quantum resonance detector of his own design, meant to measure the energy flowing through the Seraph. For days the reading had been a flat near-zero line. At 10:47, the line spiked. It didn't just jump, it went off the scale with a violent vertical slash. The machine let out a piercing shriek, a sound of pure electronic agony. "It's happening," Thorne whispered, his face bloodless. "The core has collapsed. It's begun." At the same instant, the Seraph in the clearing flared to life. It was not the gentle, pulsing glow of its arrival. This was a ferocious, blinding violet light, the same color as the crack it had torn in the sky. It was the color of raw, untamed cosmic violence. A low, powerful hum vibrated through the ground, rattling the trailer, shaking the coffee in Frank's mug. Outside, soldiers shouted in alarm. The scientists stared at their monitors, their faces a mixture of terror and scientific awe. "The conduit," Thorne yelled over the noise. "The explosion on the other end is surging through the quantum bridge." The light from the Seraph grew brighter and brighter still, until it was impossible to look at directly. It was like a miniature star had been born in the Maine woods. The air crackled with energy. The trees at the edge of the clearing began to smoke, then ignited into flames. The very ground around the crystal started to glow red hot. Frank thought, "This is it. It's going to explode. It's going to take us all with it." He braced himself for the end, his hand gripping the edge of the console. Then something else happened. The Solace Engine, the global field of energy that had powered the world, died. All at once. Across the planet, lights flickered and went out. Cars coasting on electric power rolled to a silent stop. The ever-present hum that had become the background noise of human existence vanished. The world was plunged into a sudden, shocking silence. In the clearing, the violet light of the Seraph reached an impossible crescendo. Cracks began to appear along its crystalline surface, spiderwebbing out from the core. They weren't dark cracks, but fissures of pure white-hot energy. The raw power of a supernova trying to tear its way into our reality. The hum rose in pitch to an unbearable shriek. The crystal vibrated so violently it became a blur. And then it shattered. It did not explode, it imploded. The light, the sound, the energy. It all collapsed inward in an instant. The Seraph folded in on itself and vanished, leaving behind nothing but a circle of scorched, glassy earth and a puff of fine, grey dust that hung in the air for a moment before settling. The silence that followed was the most profound Frank had ever known. The fire in the trees sputtered and died, as if starved of the energy that had created it. The glow from the ground faded. The shriek from Thorne's machine cut out. It was over. Frank and Thorne stumbled out of the trailer into a world that felt fundamentally changed. The air was still. The sky was just an ordinary sky. In the center of the clearing where the emissary of a galactic civilization had rested, there was now just a blackened circle of dirt. The bridge was closed. The connection was severed. The miracle and the curse were both gone. Thorne walked slowly to the center of the circle and knelt down, scooping up a handful of the glassy soil and grey dust. He let it run through his fingers. "It's gone," Thorne said, his voice hollow. "The conduit overloaded. It channeled the initial wave of the blast, and then it broke. It acted like a cosmic fuse. It saved us." Frank looked up at the sky. It looked the same as it had an hour ago, but it wasn't. Up there, impossibly far away, a sun was gone. A solar system was a cloud of expanding gas and radiation. A world of light was cosmic dust. The aid had been received. The bill had been paid. Humanity was safe, plunged back into the dark, but safe. And utterly, completely alone with what it had done. 6 months later, Harmony Creek was just a town in Maine again. The blackened, glassy circle in the woods was still there, a scar on the land that no one visited. The government had declared it a hazardous zone, though Thorne had told Frank it was perfectly inert. The world had dubbed the event the Great Silence. The sudden loss of the Solace Engine had triggered the collapse Thorne had predicted. Not a bang, but a long, slow, grinding crisis. Without the miracle energy, economies faltered, food production plummeted, and the old problems of a struggling world came rushing back with a vengeance. Humanity was like a lottery winner who had spent all the money and was now poorer and more miserable than before. There was a new field of study, xenoethics. Philosophers and politicians debated humanity's culpability on late-night talk shows. They spoke of the prime directive, a concept borrowed from old science fiction shows about not interfering with other civilizations. The irony was savage. Humanity hadn't interfered. It had simply taken what was offered with the thoughtless, grasping greed of a spoiled child. Frank Miller was still a deputy. His days were once again filled with small-town problems. Fender benders, domestic disputes, kids being kids. It was almost normal. But nothing would ever be normal for him again. He carried the ghost of the traveler in his head, the silent memory of a lost world. He drove his Explorer out to the quarry, just like he had on that first day. He parked in the same spot and looked at the flat, grey sky. He thought of the violet tear the beautiful, terrible crystal descending from the heavens. He thought of the feeling of peace, the promise of solace. His radio crackled. It was Mildred, her voice as tinny and timeless as ever. "Frank, you there? Got a call about a lost dog over on Maple. Golden retriever. Answers to Buddy." 10 to 4, Mildred, Frank said into the mic, his voice flat. "On my way." A lost dog. That was his job now, finding lost dogs. While 1,000 light years away, the expanding remnants of a supernova were carrying the dust of 1 billion souls out into the empty dark. He started the Explorer and pulled away from the quarry. He drove past the entrance to the woods where the Seraph had landed. He didn't look. He didn't have to. The image of the silent, dark crystal was burned onto the back of his eyelids. That night, Dr. Thorne called him. The old scientist had become something of a reluctant celebrity. The man who had seen the truth. He sounded tired. "I finished the analysis of the dust from the clearing, Frank," Thorne said. "And?" Frank asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "It's mostly silica and carbon, fused sand. But there were trace elements, things our science has no name for, the building blocks of the crystal." There was a pause. "And something else. The final pulse, the one that shattered the conduit, it left an imprint on the dust. A quantum signature. It's a complex wave pattern, but it's repeating, like a message." Frank's heart gave a slow, heavy beat. "What does it say?" "We can't translate it, not in a literal sense," Thorne said. His voice filled with a strange mix of sorrow and wonder. "It's not language. It's more like a final, universal mathematical constant. A statement of fact left behind by the explosion. The last thing their civilization learned." "Which is what ours?" Frank asked quietly. "What did they learn at the end?" Thorne was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "The equation roughly translates to a simple, terrible concept. The universe does not answer prayers. It only presents bills." Frank hung up the phone. He went to his porch and looked up at the night sky. The stars were bright and cold and impossibly distant. He knew that one of them, a faint and unremarkable speck, was now a lie. It was a gravestone whose light hadn't reached them yet. The Galactic Federation had sent aid to Earth. They had reached across the unimaginable gulf between worlds with a desperate hope for communion, for help, for solace. And in return, humanity, in its infinite, terrified and selfish need, had given them a supernova. The stars seemed to watch him, silent and judging. And for the first time, Frank Miller felt truly, utterly afraid of the dark.